So one of the themes that we've really been hitting on is this idea that change is going to be driven by multiple aspects within the environment, that a part of that open systems model is recognizing that change can come from the inputs, the demand for the outputs, new technologies or new best practices and throughputs, but also environmental changes, including changes in customer desires, but also legal changes and legislative changes in how the business is actually being conducted. And all of that can result in basically the reality that organizations need to change to continue to thrive because the various conditions that allowed them to thrive are not going to be stable. Some industries are more challenged than others, but all industries have to be ready to basically allow a structured and purposeful process to change. And that's the idea behind organizational development. We're going to really focus now on overcoming the resistance to change because change by its nature is going to be resisted. So many organizations are being forced to change radically, and this is nothing new, but it is more common and more frequent in the modern business world. Organizations face major challenges in managing this change, and we've kind of been making the point that an organization that is doing change proactively, trying to anticipate needed changes, and also creating a culture that allows organizational development support will usually be able to manage these changes better than an organization that is having to adapt quickly when they are not necessarily ready to. And what we're really going to focus on in this set of lectures is really how do you actually set the stage, if you will, or the framework to increase the likelihood of change being successful and actually having the outcomes we're hoping to achieve with that change. And people, for the most part, are going to be the focus of the most serious challenges that we have to change. It's the people of the organization themselves that are going to be the main elements that are going to resist change. Change is usually going to be driven by the decision makers, the stockholders, or external events. That's what is often driving the need for change. What drives the resistance to change is usually the actual people that are in the organization and are the ones that are doing the day-to-day work. And it is important to recognize that large-scale change does incur significant problems and challenges in the very nature of how that change is going to affect the actual employees of the organization. So changes on a personal level, just recognizing that any change, any intervention that is aimed at altering how an organization behaves, produces, policies, structure is going to be impacting people on a personal level. Each individual has a set pattern of behaviors, defined relationships with others, and the procedures and job skills that they currently are using. So any change is likely to incur differences for individuals on at least one, if not all three of these: who they're working with, how they're behaving on the job, what are the procedures they follow, and what skills are being accessed and at what levels and how often. So to be recognized that, again, generally speaking, we're comfortable when we feel stability and when we feel that we understand our job roles, and what's expected of us. So change by its very nature is going to result in someone feeling less secure in the knowledge of what they're doing in their job. And also a lot of uncertainty is then going to come in of what does my job look like now? What is my new position in this organization? So even if it is a positive change that most people recognize the need for, there is still going to be on an individual level a natural reactance, a natural resistance to changing the way things have been done. Changes on an organizational level are more about the structures, the policies, procedures, structures, manufacturing process, and workflows that occur in the organization through, if you will, the throughputs of the open systems model. But again, how each one of these impacts the rest of the organization. So a change in just policy may still impact how manufacturing is done and how workflow flows. So really what we're talking about is the very first stage of determining how to deal with resistance to change is to start to really think about what is the intervention that we're doing. How is it going to affect each person individually, and how is it going to affect the organization as a whole? And what secondary impacts are there going to be? So if all we're changing is the structure, how will that by its nature also possibly impact workflows and individuals? So a good way to kind of conceptualize the process of change is to kind of walk through the life cycle of resistance to change. So phase one is usually when change is being introduced, and this is often before an actual intervention. This can be occurring as the organization has recognized the need to change and discussions are happening. This can also be the phase where organizational development specialists are starting to communicate the need for change. So only a few people are usually going to see the need for change immediately, and resistance is going to appear fairly massive at this phase. This is especially true in an organization that does not already have a culture receptive to the idea of innovation and change. Phase two is forces identified. So this is basically going to be the process where we're trying to identify what forces are driving the change and what forces are going to resist that change. This is also where we're going to start to really think about how is the change going to affect both individuals and the organization. Also during this phase, we should see a little bit of the novelty of the change tending to disappear. And what that represents is the successful communication of what is happening and why throughout the organization. So phase three is the direct conflict. So the intervention is now actually being implemented. There is actual efforts to cause the change, whether it's a policy change, a structural change, changing from individual employees to work teams. But now we actually have the showdown between forces. This phase often means the life or death of change, because this is when people are going to be most resistant to that change, because it's now actually happening. So this is pretty much the crisis period in the life cycle of change. If the forces that resist change become overpowering, in other words, their reactance or resistance to change is having such a negative effect on the company's morale, its engagement, its productivity, that the change is starting to be seen as more of a problem than the problem it's meant to fix. That can actually result in the change failing to take and possibly not being successful. If the change is resisted at first, but it is clearly being seen through communication and through practice that it is resulting in a better workflow, a better set of structures, a better set of policies, this can also be the tipping point where it goes the other way, where there's less and less resistance. Phase four, the remaining resistance starts to be seen as stubborn, so you see more and more people recognizing the need for change. Possibly resistors will mobilize to shift the balance of power. There may be some last attempts to try to stop the change or come up with a counter to the change. But for the most part, as we move to phase four, this is when we're starting to see more and more, if you will, a majority of the people starting to recognize that the change is a successful one. It's one that the organization is needing. And we're also starting to become more and more confident that we're going to result in a successful change to the organization. Phase five is usually the end of the life cycle of resistance to change. Basically, this is when Kurt Levin would refer to we've restabilized. The new norm is the change, not the old way of doing things. There is always probably going to be a few resistors, people that are still somewhat resentful, but they're now starting to be very few and often feel as alienated as the advocates for change were in the very first phase. It should also be recognized that the process of change will sometimes increase turnover, people leaving the organization. This isn't always a bad thing because it could be that the organization is doing a needed change, but that change is now resulting in an organization that certain individuals really don't feel comfortable working for anymore. So you can imagine if you spent 15 years of your life working as an individual contractor in an organization, i.e., you were hired by the organization, you worked for it, but your work was very independent and you didn't work with others. And suddenly the organization realizes that old way of doing things is very inefficient. We're losing a lot of communication. We're moving to work teams. And this change is successful. You resisted that change in phase two and phase three, and even in phase four, but you also recognize that you started to become in the minority, and now there's only a couple of people that agree with you, and most people are really enjoying and are engaged with this new team structure. You may decide it's time to leave this organization. I'm not comfortable with this. This is not how I like to work. I'm alienated at this point, and I'm still resisting. So it may actually be a bad person environment fit. Whenever we're talking about organizations, we often are trying to find the right people for the right jobs. And that job is not only the actual skills to do the job, but also the culture of the organization. So whenever we make major changes to jobs and culture, we may actually be shifting it to where we do lose some employees. Ideally, they'll be replaced as more people come in that now are attracted to the new culture, the new way of doing things. Another model to look at this is to kind of consider the main 5 factors or change factors that we can have some control over to increase the success of change. Now, again, some of these may be out of our control, but the first one is the advocates of change. So who's actually leading the force for this change? Is it OD practitioners? Are those people being accepted as experts within the organization? Is there clear support from upper management for these changes? The more that you can say yes, the people that are driving the change are respected, the need for change is recognized, and they're communicating it very well throughout the organization, and top management is fully supporting the change, that increases the likelihood of success of change. The degree of change. The more change that we're doing at one time, the less likely success will happen. That's another reason to really try to keep organizations in the OD model and not the OT model. Again, organizational development means that we're doing gradual changes, we're bringing in new changes, but each change is often its own intervention because we're not trying to do a rush. Organizational transformation means the organization waited too long and is having to make massive changes fairly quickly. So the larger the degree of change, the more change that we're doing, the less likely it is going to be successful. And the more likely the forces that are going to resist it are going to resist it stronger. We're usually more comfortable with small changes in sequence than a series of changes all at the same time. Time frame plays right into this as well. The more time we have, the longer we can take to actually kind of shepherd the change through the organization, the more likely it's going to succeed. And again, the shorter time frame, the less likely it is to be a successful change. And just as a side note, when I talk about successful change, I'm talking about an intervention that changes the organization in a positive way that actually then the success of that change is that it takes and it becomes the new norm. Impact on culture. So if the change fits well in the existing culture of the organization, it is more likely to be accepted. If the change is in counter or in conflict with the current culture, or is a change of the culture itself, it is more likely to be resisted. And finally, a factor to determine if the success of change is a little bit less about the actual pre-existing factors, but how the change is actually being evaluated. So the more that a OD specialist can illustrate that the change is resulting in positive, measurable outcomes, the more likely it will be seen as successful and will fully take as more and more people will accept that this is a good idea. So another way to kind of conceptualize this is another 2x2 model, and this one's pretty straightforward. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but the two biggest factors here then are the degree of change and the impact on culture. So if there's a low impact on culture and a small change, there's usually going to be fairly low resistance. This is just small changes in policy, small tweaks to the organization, and this is where our least resistance is going to be. If we have a small degree of change but a high impact on culture, we're going to get some resistance. Likewise, if we have a large change but small impact on culture, we're going to get some resistance. The main thing on this model to recognize, and there's a reason the model is kind of skewed, that is you get to more and more degrees of change. The larger the amount of actual changes trying to be implemented at once, and the larger those changes are also impacting the culture. And that's not just the stated culture of the organization, that can be norms of behavior, those psychological contracts, in other words, what individuals expect their jobs to be. The more you're impacting that, the higher and higher the amount of resistance is going to be, and the more and more that an OD specialist is really going to have to focus on making sure that they are stacking the deck from that last model of change factors, of trying to make sure that the right other elements are involved. In other words, that they're selling it, that they're really well understood, that upper management is modeling the need for success, that the actual, if possible, that we have at least a long time frame if we're talking about major changes. And again, just kind of the evaluation of the change is well maintained, and information about that change and its successes are being very clearly communicated. So at this point, kind of going to the force field model, and if you remember, that model from last week was mainly focused on the elements that either are driving for change versus the elements that are resisting that change. So we do want to identify these, and we're generally looking for the driving forces towards acceptance. So what is getting people to want to see change? So it's anything that increases the organization willingness to implement change. and it varies in intensity depending on the situation. So dissatisfaction with the present situation. So the more people are aware there's a problem, and the more that that problem is affecting their own personal engagement and satisfaction, the more likely that they are willing to express or accept a change. External pressures towards change. So if there's clearly forces that are driving the change and it's easy to communicate, if we do not adjust to these external changes, we are going to be losing business and basically having to downsize or possibly even close our doors. Momentum towards change. So the more the organization has already been making changes, where changes become a part of the culture, that builds a momentum that also drives the forces towards accepting change. And also motivation by management. So how management is motivating the change and rewarding the change. So effectively, many of these factors are also about communicating clearly with individuals within the organization about what the external pressures are, about the need for change, about motivation and rewards for change, and how that change will increase their current or decrease their current dissatisfaction with the present situation. Restraining forces blocking change. So we're basically dealing with human nature here. So uncertainty regarding change. Change is always somewhat scary because we don't know what it's going to look like. We know what the status quo is. So that kind of falls into that fear of the unknown. What's going to happen? How is this going to affect my job? It also is a disruption of routine. People may have a worry that they're going to lose benefits, that their new job role may actually be different as far as the advantages they get out of their jobs. They may feel a threat to security, so change usually is occurring because the organization needs to change, and that makes people start to worry about, well, how secure is my position in this company if we're having to do these changes in the first place? Often individuals will see it as a possible threat to their current position power or worry that their power is going to be redistributed. It may disturb existing social networks, so those kind of unwritten norms of behavior within the organization, and also the conformity to norms and culture. So again, a lot of times changes may occur within the current culture, but sometimes they may be against the culture. And remember, when we talk about organizational culture, we're not just talking about stated values, we're also talking about the norms and expectations of the individuals within the organization. Now, again, some of these can also be directly impacted by communication, and I'm going to keep coming back to that idea that one of the key jobs an organizational development specialist has is communicating both the advantages and basically resisting or directly addressing these restraining forces to try to reduce their effects. So the driving forces and restraining forces act in tandem. An effective change program really focuses on increasing driving forces and making people more aware of them, while decreasing restraining forces and providing information that debunks their claims or their uncertainty. And again, this is really following that force field analysis model that we talked about previously. So strategies to also increase motivation. So these are managerial tools that can be used to, again, increase the likelihood of change being successful. Creating a climate conducive to change, clearly articulating a vision, effective communication, the leadership and role modeling of managers, participation of members within each team, creating reward systems to actually clearly show that the organization is willing to reward people taking on these new behaviors, these new interventions. Negotiation, agreement, and politics, power strategies, all of these are things to kind of consider that can be used to help go through this process of reducing the restraining forces and increase those driving forces.